to Spotlight Sessions, where we shine a light on incredible individuals and organizations and the work that they do. I am your host, Josh Basil. I'm a C4-5 quadriplegic, paralyzed below my shoulders, and I'm a power wheelchair user. I am the Community Relations Manager at accessiBe's and a passionate disability rights advocate and attorney, focused on breaking down barriers to access and inclusion for people with disabilities. Today, on accessiBe's Spotlight Sessions, we are joined by Mike Paciello. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, Josh. How are you? Good to see you again.
I'm so glad you're here today, and I'm excited for everybody to learn more about you. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I usually like to start by saying I'm probably an enigma. That's usually what I tell my wife. I have been in the accessibility profession since the mid-'80s, so pushing close to 40 years now. It's been my passion all my life, all my profession. Have worked in various aspects of the business. Started off with braille documentation and working on electronic solutions for that, up through into CD, DVD environments, into the web application software, and that's what I keep doing today.
So when did that start? Was that in the 90s, 2000s?
Well, I actually started in accessibility in roughly around 84, 85. Yeah.
Wow. What did it look like back
then? I had hair.
What did the accessibility world? What were the conversations around?
The company that I worked at that time was Digital Equipment Corporation. No longer exists. Probably portions of it exist in HP these days. Back then, electronic software where people with disabilities were concerned was really in an infantile stage. People used PCs, but they were just being released by IBM and a few others. Microsoft, was using their Windows 3.0 operating system at that particular time. It was very basic, very character-centric. So not really a whole lot just in terms of what we're dealing with today on software and technology, mobile, enterprise platforms. But what was a challenge and how I got started was the production of accessible print materials for people with print disabilities, especially those who are blind, who are braille readers. The first project that I took on for my company was to provide the National Braille Press in Boston with our publications for our software. We digital wrote operating system software, and those publications were huge volumes, just very, very big, hundreds of pages of volumes. And if the National Braille Press happened to know a person who needed access to that operating system, digital was very popular. There were a lot of computer systems out there. They would request the documentation. I would bring it to them, and then they would take that and convert it into Braille. That process of creating Braille manually would take them, a year or more just for one publication.
Wow.
And this was at a time when the electronic publishing field was just starting to really branch out. Charles Goldfarb had already come out with the first specifications as related to the Standard Generalized Markup Language, or SGML. It wasn't even called that at that time. I think I recall it being called GenCode. And Digital had already adopted a similar format for trying to produce its electronic documentation. And at that same time, we were really focused on output to PostScript by Adobe. This is pre-PDF, before that was there. So PostScript was a popular electronic output. And it gave me an idea after watching this painstaking process that the Braille folks, the converter folks were doing over in at National Braille Press, that maybe if I could take a file today electronically, mark it up with elements and codes that we're familiar with, kind of like what a web page looks like, and then output it so that it could be easier to produce for Braille, large text, and voice-ready files. Wow, that would be great, right? That's what got me started. And so I went out. There wasn't really much of an internet back then, but what what aspects of it, like Gopher and other things. We had email. I reached out to others in the community that were kind of working in this space. One particular person, a good friend of mine and colleague, George Kirscher. And George had a little business called Computerized Books for the Blind. And so George and I got together, and ultimately it led to us forming an international working group called the International Committee for Accessible Document Design, or ICAD. And together, our group, and this was international, we have folks from Europe, Canada, US, Australia, Japan, several countries that were involved in this effort. And we worked for the better part of 2 years, maybe more, to develop what became a publishing standard, an accessible publishing standard, the first of its kind, that was adopted by the American Association of Publishers. I think it still exists, for producing electronic documentation that could be easily converted, outputted to braille, large text, and voice-ready files.
I love stories like this. It's just being able, it's almost like a history lesson, but also just like knowing how to be a change maker, what it takes to do it, and like kind of being able to think differently.
Yeah.
And being able to get out there and try to like shake things up a little bit. So like, thank you for always shaking things up along your accessibility kind of journey within this space. I know your career is in many ways, I don't know, I feel like your career is still young if you want it to be, because you've just got such a brilliant mind to be able to really impact the world. So thank you.
Yeah, I don't know about brilliant mind, but I love working with others, and I love the passion for accessibility and disabilities in the profession. So
tell me more about kind of what are some fun stories about accessibility and kind of the journey you've been on that are kind of fun to share with the audience?
Yeah, well, of course, that was a fun journey. That was my first opportunity to really work with individuals with disabilities. I had actually had some friendships with individuals who were deaf, and I actually did some sign language interpreting back then, just as kind of a volunteer effort with my church and whatnot. But this was my first time professionally where I thought, hey, I like this. I can make a career out of this, and I'm going to make a career out of this. So it started with the whole documentation legacy, so to speak. As we saw, it went from electronic documentation that we're producing on paper to the transition to CD and DVDs and that output, to readers, and back then IBM and Digital had their own competitive or proprietary reading applications that you could put on a PC, or back then we were using mainframe computers and whatnot. So we basically had terminals, smart terminals. They weren't even computers that we could use these tools on. One interesting story that I had an experience there, again, was at Digital. Was actually, well, there's a lot of stories there, but this one I thought was interesting. So I wanted to take all of Digital's computer documentation, put it onto a DVD, and that documentation would be fully accessible and renderable. So the easiest part, believe it or not, of that whole experience was actually gathering all the documentation, running it through our SGML processor that we had at Digital, and creating it in the formats that it needed to be. Plus, I had great colleagues at Digital who were very, very helpful. Well, I'll never forget. I mean, I haven't seen either one of them in about 30 years, but John Mattioli and Linda Day. And they were both blind. They both worked at Digital. Actually, another friend of mine, TV Raman, was also a blind architect and engineer, research engineer at Digital. So the three of them always would help me produce what we needed to make sure that what we produced was useful and accessible at that level. But here's where the fun part was. I turned it into a product, into a DVD product that would be distributed by Digital to anyone who wanted to buy it, and subscribe to it. So it was based on a subscription, and we would do, I think we had it scheduled for a biannual subscription. So twice yearly, you'd get an update to any of the publications that we did. What was different about that, because Digital actually had a product where they just produce their documentation for sighted users, right? Non-print disabled. And it came with, on top of it, that browser, their reader that they had, a proprietary reader, which was completely inaccessible. But I knew that the blind community and those with print disabilities didn't need it. So all I did was I just put the documentation on that DVD, and we distributed. The first 3 months, the sales of that product skyrocketed. They exceeded the main product. And we couldn't figure out why. What was the turn on to this whole thing? Well, as it turned out, many of the clients that were buying the subscription to the version that was for the sighted and had that proprietary reader were canceling those and taking the subscription to my DVD. Was called VIO, Vision Impaired Online Documentation, because it didn't have a reader. Now they could write their own readers, for it, and not have to pay for that license to that. I think that just, so it was very fun. It was fun watching that whole thing. Long story short, Digital canceled the project because it was eating into their profits. But
Just eating into the
yeah, but it was a lot of fun. It was great fun doing it. Just this, I couldn't believe how it took off. The product managers who were helping me along the whole thing were just blown away by it.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you for sharing that story. And I'd love to know, so along these many years that you've been at this, tell me what's your favorite, or what's an accomplishment that you're most proud of?
Yeah, I thought about this because I've really been fortunate and blessed, so to speak. I've, between working and creating the Web Accessibility Initiative at the W3C, creating the documentation there on VIOLD, ICAD was a huge accomplishment. It was monumental at that particular time. But I think of all of the quote unquote achievements that I've had, the one that I'm most proud of was my company, TPG, Paciello Group. And the reason why is because I had this vision, even when I was at Digital, that one day if I could just pull together the best people in the world to help us focus on and deliver services, professional services to clients all over the world, to help them ensure that their digital assets were usable and accessible to people with disabilities, that would be great. That was a dream that I had, and I kind of outlined. I had never launched a business, prior to that, but eventually I did. I launched my first version of the business, which ironically was called WebAble, which is the name of the company that I have today. That was a web portal during the .com days, and I got investment money to go in with it and went with it. But I still had this vision of pulling together these great folks, and TPG became the fulfillment of that dream. I was very fortunate to have made colleagues over the years and friends over the year who were willing to make a great sacrifice professionally, and economically, to come and work and join me, at TPG. So people like Steve Faulkner, Hans Hillen, Jez Lemon, Carl Groves, Sarah Horton, David Sloan. These are people who are known, Henny Swan, Leonie Watson. These are people, anyone that is in this industry know them. They are brand names in and of themselves. But these are friends of mine. These are colleagues of mine that I was able to work with. And we kept that going for the better part of 10 years, I think, together before I ended up selling the company. We ended up selling the company in 2017 to Vispero.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's interesting what can happen when you bring the right people together with that are trying to change the world. And it's so important to continue to have the right minds, the right conversations. I'm a big believer in power in numbers and being able to see what we can do to shake things up and kind of push things in the right direction and try to really do more to help people with disabilities. There's so much that can be done and so many lives that are kind of waiting for opportunities to be there.
Yeah.
And accessibility for me it kind of changes the game. And I kind of want to know what does accessibility mean to you?
Yeah, I had thought about that about what it means to me. And really, believe it or not, I can kind of sum it up in one word: empathy. Now, I've had some individuals that have disagreed with me, but here's the thing. In order to really understand, to design, to architect, to develop, and then roll out any kind of interface that is inclusive in nature, that is usable and accessible to people with disabilities, you need to put yourself in their shoes. You need to understand how a person with disabilities interacts with, regardless of what it is, whether it's, whether it's a chair like yours, a power chair like yours, and how that's designed so that you can interact with the interfaces that you have there, or whether it's just a standard chair to sit in, right? Because a standard chair, you might say, well, a chair's a chair. No, it's not. A chair to a person who's blind is a different interface in how they approach it, how they get into it. A chair for an individual that is shorter in stature, right, is a different. It's a different interface. So in order to really design and develop things, to me, accessibility is all about being empathic and really learning to understand how users with disabilities particularly interact with the interface.
They're so true. So for me, with my power wheelchair, I'm a trial attorney, I'm an advocate for life, but living in the Washington D.C. area, I'm on Capitol Hill often. Not as much these days with COVID and the pandemic, but like a few years back, there was legislation that was trying to change complex rehab technologies, which did the billings around the customization of power wheelchairs. And it would have destroyed customizing wheelchairs for people. And, my body, my functionality is very unique to me. And the bill would have kind of destroyed and stripped away being able to kind of build out customization and the billing around that. And it's just, we ended up doing a roll on Capitol Hill with the United Spinal Association, where we had hundreds of people in chairs from across the country roll on Capitol Hill and saying, this is important and this is why. So like, I love being able to recognize that with that empathy and with that usability, that functionality of giving somebody a customization to be able to have their best day, their best ability to function in the world. It's so important. And a lot of people don't recognize like the simplest thing. Like, I have these special buttons in my headrest that allow me to turn on and off my wheelchair. If I didn't have that, I wouldn't be able to do it. I wouldn't be able to turn it on and off. There's so many little things with being able to have tilt actuators, and there's a million different pieces to my custom wheelchair that gives me a safer, it gives me a safer experience and a more usable experience with the day. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up with accessibility, with empathy. It rings so true.
Yeah.
Let
me just tell you a little. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You first.
No, Mike, all you.
So let me just tell you a little story about how, empathy really is a combination of usability and accessibility. Okay. An experience that I had a few years ago, we were doing some work. I think I could talk about it. I could use the name of the client was with Walgreens. And Walgreens is to be commended for a number of different things. But at that particular time, they were building a factory. I think it was in the Carolinas, might have been in North Carolina. And that factory was meant to employ individuals with disabilities, especially those with cognitive and motor skill disabilities. And so we were doing some user testing because one of the jobs would include interacting with a website. So we needed to design that website that would be usable by all those. Cognition in terms of designing software is still, a work in progress. This is going back 8 or 9 years ago. Since then, we've had the 508 committees, and we've done some work with the W3C and 508 to try to address some of the cognition challenges. But at that time, there was almost nothing. So I went with one of my partners at that time, Charlie Pike. who still works at TPGi now. And Charlie and I did some user studies on various individuals that would be interacting with this system. And we learned something that I never really thought about before. We had, a web page, very simple in construct. Your main navigation sat on the top, and then you had a footer on the bottom, and you scrolled up and down to click on or interact with the system. But what we learned from those studies with individuals with cognition disabilities was that when the page scrolled at that time, so did the main navigation bar. So when an individual with a cognition disability was trying to navigate, because of generally memory loss, their inability to remember, they couldn't pick up on the fact that the navigation bar they just needed to scroll up to get to the navigation bar. So we saw this repeatedly. It happened with a number of our studies. So what do we ended up doing? We ended up designing a navigation bar that was sticky. It froze. So you could scroll up and down on the page, but the navigation bar would always stay there. So that when the person went to go look up, they want to go back to home, or they wanted to go to search, it was always there for them to do that. So there's a good example of learning to understand how do users interact, being empathic and making it work for them.
It's so true. Being able to give choice and being able to create a better experience for all abilities. Like, there's so many different unique communities within the disability community that make it up. And each community can benefit in different ways if you give them more options, more choice.
Yep.
And it's just, I know my life personally, every time I have more choice, it ends up leading to more independence and more opportunity, which I'm very excited about the rest of my life and all the things that are possible. And as technology evolves, I've really found opportunities that evolve. Like even when I was first paralyzed in 2004, iPhones really were not there. And it's incredible, where we've gone, since, like you said, in the 80s, when I was born. And it's just every decade, it seems like there's just a new opportunity for people with disabilities, which is exciting to see where we go. So, Mike, I just want to thank you so much for joining me today, joining accessiBe's Spotlight session, and being willing to have a conversation and share with the world kind of your experiences and a little bit about yourself.
Thanks.
So, Mike, thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh. Hey, I wanted to leave you with one parting thought. One of the questions that you had asked me was if you had a conversation with anybody in the world, who would it be, right? And one message to business. So I'm going to try and combine the both of them, because I'm right in the middle of reading a book right now that's having a powerful impact on my own life from a business standpoint. So the person I would love to meet is a person by the name of Ron Sharon. And I'm not sure if you know Ron, but he's been around for many, many years. I first became aware of him from other books that he had written when he was at GE. And he was Jack Welch's right-hand man at that particular time. He's come out with a new book. It's called Rethinking Competitive Advantage. And there were two things that he said in this book on the whole new model of the business world that really resonates with our community of people with disabilities. The first thing he said was, a personalized consumer experience is key to exponential growth. So he's talking about personalization as being a key attribute now to, quote unquote, the new digital economy, right? And new digital ecosystem, which I couldn't agree with more. And of course, that's an accessibility mantra that we've been saying for years now. The other thing that he said, though, that also impressed me, he said, leaders continuously learn, imagine, and break through obstacles to create the change that other companies must contend with. And so that's kind of where I think a lot of us are going with some of the ventures that we're trying to do. People are contending with some of our ideas and thoughts that kind of break with the norm. But if we keep at them, if we're persistent, right? Calvin Coolidge said persistence is omnipotent. We'll break through, and I think we'll change the world in ways that will be better, particularly for individuals with disabilities.
I love this advocacy right here. I feel like that has embedded within it so much of what it takes to be a good advocate and to be a true change maker.
Exactly.
And a thinker.
Exactly.
is willing to tackle that. So just Mike, again, thank you so much for being on our spotlight sessions today, and wishing you well, and look forward to continue our friendship.
Same thing. Same right back at you, Josh. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Mike.